that is being delivered across the country, across the globe, which is really fantastic. Just another minute and then we'll get started. I've obviously got a presentation to go through today, and please feel free to post comments, questions in the chat. I've got my phone here as well, so I'm going to try to see those as I'm delivering the presentation so I can answer your questions along the way. But also, there's the opportunity to grab the mic. So if you wanted to ask me verbally ask me a question, please feel free, ask to grab the mic, and I'll hand you over the mic as well. All right, so I'm going to get started, and as I said, I'm welcome to my talk on tiny homes in the land down under. It's in Australia. I'm actually in the southern part of Australia. I'm in Melbourne, Victoria. And I would like to first off thank the organisers, Zach and Jason, for organising this event. I'm really, really pleased to be invited to speak about what we're doing in Australia on tiny houses and how we're helping to escalate the legal living in tiny houses. It's a journey, as you can all experience, and most of you can attest to as well. So I want to share with you some of our processes, what we've been doing, and who the Australian Tiny House Association is. So I will share my screen where the presentation is. If you've just joined us, welcome. I'm Janine Strachan, the President of the Australian Tiny House Association. We'll go through some slides, and certainly, as I said, if you've got some comments, questions to make, please jot them down, and I'll keep an eye on my phone as well if you've got any questions that I need to respond to. If I don't respond to them at the time, I will certainly get to them at the end as well. So, who is the Australian Tiny House Association? So we were formed in 2018 by 5 people who shared obviously a passion for tiny houses. They wanted to see it as they saw it as a solution to our chronic housing crisis across all capital cities of Australia. Some people wanted to live tiny, others wanted to support the tiny house movement. Now, I would typically be calling it a sector or an industry, just because a movement suggests that we're all in the same direction. So in Australia, we typically call it a sector or community through the association. That is. So we are an association of tiny house builders, dwellers, DIYs, people who want to build their own tiny house, like many of you here, as well as others that are tiny house enthusiasts. Not too sure if you want to build tiny or live tiny, but you're wanting to find out what this is all about. So that's what we're focused. That's who we represent. Our mission is to find a national approach that overcomes the regulatory hurdles preventing Australians from living in their tiny houses. And we do this through consultation within the tiny house sector and across all levels of government. I'm sure that sounds familiar to most of you here. So tiny houses are not new in Australia, and back in the 1850s, when Melbourne's population was booming, prospectors were flocking from around the globe en route to the goldfields. And the gold rush created a chronic housing shortage and also an exodus of skilled tradesmen from the city. So enter the kit homes from overseas. They were flat-packed. They had flat-packed furniture only for entire houses. These prefabricated homes were built overseas, then dismantled, and every component was labelled and loaded into packing crates and shipped and reassembled in all corners of the British Empire, including Australia. And these ones here are actually, some of them are still in existence. There's about, I think, 2 in existence. That's in South Melbourne, one of our inner city suburbs of the city of Melbourne. So, they're heritage listed, as you can imagine, but, this is not new. It's just that this is where we are today, is trying to identify a housing solution where people can't afford to buy the land. So, or they want to, there's so many other different reasons for wanting to live or interested in tiny house living. And so we'll have a look at that as well. But really, tiny houses on wheels are straddling a crevasse for us. And it's not quite a house and it's not a caravan. Tiny houses can offer alternative housing solutions to many. They can support families, help vulnerable and displaced people, provide housing choice, and leave a much smaller environmental footprint. Tiny houses can also obviously provide the shelter, security, and warmth, comfort, and pride. And we certainly have a lot of homelessness in our society, and that is certainly not alone, and not an experience that most developed nations have as well, which is an indictment on our society. But at the same time, this sector, this direction that we're looking at for tiny houses is certainly something that can contribute to that, a solution to that. So how we define tiny houses, and they are a movable dwelling suitable for permanent residential use and with self-contained amenities and services and the option to be grid connected. And a tiny house can be, a movable tiny house is a transportable structure with the ability to be moved. Generally speaking, that would be on a skid, or a tiny house on wheels is constructed on a trailer designed to road legal dimensions, which can be moved. Now, this is our second iteration over the last few years about a definition of tiny houses. There is not a definition in Australia for tiny houses. A lot of people think of them as a caravan and not quite a house, which is that image that I showed you earlier. So as a result of that, our association decided that we needed to create a definition so that we can start communicating on a consistent basis about what a tiny house is. Now, obviously, there is also an additional tiny house, which is where they're built on a structure. It could be on a slab. It could be on footings. They are already legal, and they are cottages, bungalows, granny flats, ancillary dwellings, secondary dwellings. They're all the names that we use here in Australia under our planning scheme. So just here's a few pictures of, I thought I'd intersperse the text slides with some of our pictures of some of our tiny houses in Australia. So Tiny House to Go was one of the founding members of the Australian Tiny House Association. They build a lot with natural materials. They're very contemporary in design. They have a lot of plywood in them, a lot of natural light. And you'll see another one of their designs in a couple of later pictures as well. But really comfortable, a lot of timber cladding, as well as we have a lot of, this is the cladding here is colorbond cladding. That is a material that we use a lot in our tiny houses. And those materials are generally all sourced from Australia. So where do we sit? Well, where do tiny houses sit in the Australian regulations? So we are covered by local laws, planning, building, and the road transport. I've been involved in recently some discussions about looking at what's happening in other states, in other countries with tiny houses and their definitions and their regulations as well. And so I'm going to put the Australian slant on, obviously, where we sit with our regulations. Local laws are what is where we oversee, or where the local councils or local shire oversees regulations, has an oversee of their regulations for their locality. And it varies across Australia, and it largely limits any person to permanently live in a caravan. Now, we know that tiny houses are not caravans, and I see a lot of the commentary out of the US about, the separation between RVs and tiny houses and caravans. We all recognise that tiny houses are there as a representation of a dwelling for people to live in permanently, and that's the focus for us. New South Wales, one of our states, allows only a relative of the primary building to live in the caravan. And remember, this is caravan on a private land where there is no payment. So even if somebody did live in a caravan, they're not allowed to pay the primary person in the primary household any money towards living in there. In Western Australia, which covers a third of the Australian landscape, you can only stay in a caravan for 3 days out of 28 when you're on private land. So if I'm just checking my comments, if you can imagine the amount of time and energy it goes to setting up your tiny house with your jack studs and with your stormwater outlet and your power supply and maybe a deck and stuff like that. So, by the time you've actually set that up, maybe it's 3 days and you've got to be, unpacking it and moving on again. So that's not a desirable situation. In other shires and councils across in other states, we can allow permanent living in a caravan if no nuisance occurs and no payment occurs. So it'd have to be a very generous landholder to actually come and say, oh, look, I've got all this land, why don't you come along here for nothing? Now, there are people certainly who do offset payments, direct payments with, work on the land to help them as a caretaker mode, which is great. That can overcome some of those restraints. But this particular point is actually few and far between. There's not a lot of councils that actually allow this particular scenario. Others restrict living to no more than 30, 60 or 90 days in the caravan. So what are we doing about our response to these local laws? So we've created an alternative local law specifically for tiny houses. So we'll be launching this in the next couple of weeks, where we've produced this position paper. So we're saying that we want to have some permit and security for people who want to live in a tiny house on wheels. So we're saying that a person must obtain a permit to occupy land and live in a tiny house on wheels on their own land or with the landowner's consent for a greater period than six consecutive months. And this overcomes a lot of the issues. Yeah, it is a shame, Melanie, that it has to be a relative. Yes. This overcomes the issue about, 3 days here, 3 days there. The requirement is to obtain a permit. The requirement to obtain a permit does not apply to a person who lives in a tiny house on wheels in a caravan park or a tiny house village, and that is registered with the council, or a use which is specifically authorised in what we call the planning scheme, or where a permit has been granted under the planning scheme. So they are irrelevant and unrelated to the local law permit. What we want to make sure is that people are being a responsible citizen when they're actually occupying their tiny house, because this is some of the feedback we've been getting from local laws. So we really want to make sure that people that when a permit is issued, that it is ensuring that there is an adequate amenity is provided for the occupants. That means that waste is being managed, wastewater is being managed, that there is sufficient space between the neighbours, so you're not actually causing a nuisance within a couple of metres of a neighbouring property. So there is distance. There could be distance provisions included in a permit. So what we've done here is we've left it quite open for the council or the shire to actually indicate what they require for acceptance to issue a 5-year local law permit. Now, this then gives the occupant of that land greater assurity that they're not going to be tapped on the, somebody's not going to come and tap them on the door, or tap on the door to say, this is enough time now, you need to move on, I've had complaints or whatever. So with these regulations, these are local regulations, this local law. So we'll get on to the state-based and also the national as well. Now, this is my tiny home. So this is my prototype. My business is also Tiny House Solutions. I build with structurally insulated panels. So this was my prototype. I built a couple of years ago. I still support structurally insulated panels, and that's what we build to. I work with a builder who will be building the tiny houses as my system, so then we can try to, where possible, encourage people to get building permits, which is a different level of regulation, because we've got some gaps there as well. So under the planning regulations in Australia, they're generally developed at a state level that prescribes land use, subdivision, and permanent structures. So something that's fixed to the land, not tiny houses on wheels, not caravans and the like. So local councils in some states can adjust their planning scheme to reflect their local needs, but overall the framework is developed at the state level, and then there's those local variations that can be developed. And due to the nature of THOW and tiny house on skids being movable structures, they don't fit at this point in time into the planning controls. So it is quite challenging to get a planning permit for a tiny house on wheel or a tiny house on skids unless they are then secured to the land. Now, the other connection between planning regulations is the next one is building permits. And even though you might get a planning permit for your structure to go on the land, there starts to have the relationship with the building permit process, which has to be aligned with the planning regulations. So even if we did go down the track of getting a planning permit, it's very, very strong chance that the local council will also trigger building permits as well. So what has our response been to this? So in 2020, we released the ATHA Planning Working Group, developed a planning policy template where we introduced methods for including tiny houses into local planning schemes, and also helping direct and encourage the development of policy statements that supported alternative housing solutions, including, of course, tiny house on wheels and tiny house on skids. So a copy of the planning policy template was sent to all state planning ministers and to the local government associations seeking support. So across Australia, we have local government associations in all states, which is really fantastic because we've got about 658 local councils or shires across Australia that are responsible for their local laws and also their planning schemes. So by actually working with the LGAs, we can help communicate a consistent message for New South Wales or for Victoria or for South Australia, which are all of our states, in all of the states. However, during COVID, what we did was we put the planning reform on a back seat because it actually required us to go and meet with, state ministers, federal ministers about, what is it that we need seeking change for. And as we all know, a lot of our through COVID, a lot of other things took the back seat. So, and wasn't a focus of our politicians. So as a result of that, we're now going to start to escalate an uptake of that and communication of that throughout 2021 as well. Here's a picture of another contemporary tiny house on wheels. This is one of our members who's actually living on farmland. We are working together with his local council to try to get a change in the local law through our alternative position paper for tiny houses on wheels. He has used all recycled material where he could obtain it from, and he's living in here with his wife, and also they've got a second tiny house on wheels for their two teenage children as well. They have made this a choice. They have got a normal traditional home only about 10 kilometres away from this property, but they really wanted to make which they've rented out, they've kept, but they've rented it out because they really wanted to start to downsize their life and really think seriously about, their ecological footprint, and how they could minimise that. So that was, that's a really great initiative, and a lot of people here might be in that same sort of boat. Within housing regulations, so we call them building regulations in Australia. So we've got housing regulations, and they're covered by one national construction code, which is really fantastic. And that does allow some minor state-based variations, but usually that's because of cyclonic conditions or other climatic conditions as well, or termite zones. But overall, we've got one national construction code, which is pretty exciting. And like last year, I was working with the Australian Building Codes Board, who oversees and reviews the National Construction Code, which gets reviewed every 3 years, for the possible inclusion of tiny houses on wheels and skids to be included in the housing regs. We've put that on hold until we trial and our tiny house construction guide, which I'll talk to you about in a minute, so that we can see whether, if going down and including tiny houses on wheels and skids in the NCC is the pathway that we really need to achieve. That is one of the pathways. So in 2020 and 21, I was overseeing, my background is building and construction and planning. So prior to being in the role as the president of the Australian Tiny House Association, I was vice president of it and overseeing this work of planning and building. So I developed a building reference group, which is to be sympathetic to the NCC, which is the National Construction Code, and where we couldn't, what variations did we need to incorporate? So we've just literally finished the guide only in the last couple of days. It's taken hundreds of hours to develop and review, and we're just about to release it for a trial for a 2-year period, so we can then gauge feedback from tiny house builders and also the DIY sector to gauge their feedback and see what's working for them, and where, if anywhere, do we need to make this change to the tiny house construction guide. So that is going to help us explore our future regulatory pathways for advocacy. And we have a couple of different pathways that we're going to have a look at. As I said, NCC is one of them. There's an international one that we're exploring at the moment. And then there's also the local law one that we're also exploring. So, we want to give our members and also the tiny house sector enough information and guidance so that they can actually feel confident and go to their local councils and talk to them about where do they sit with tiny houses. So the issue is also that tiny houses on wheels. We have what we call a vehicle VSB1, which is it's a national regulatory pathway of transporting vehicles on the road. It stands for the Vehicle Standards Bulletin 1, and it dictates the length, the height, and the width of unpermitted, so you don't need to get an extra permit for trailers. So if you keep within 4.5 tonnes, if you keep within 2.5 metres wide and 12.5 metres long, including the drawbar, and within the 4.3 metres high, then you don't need a road transport permit. Once you go outside those dimensions, then you do need an oversized permit, and that will be more challenging when you go from build it in one state and transport it to another state. So typically, the majority of our tiny houses on wheels and skids are actually built within these regs. And also, we don't need an engineer to design the tiny house trailer to house the tiny house on. Now, our guide that we've just released, or we're just in the process of releasing, actually encourages people to use to get a structural engineer to certify the connection between the trailer, the walls, and the roof. Because as we all know, even though tiny houses on wheels may never be transported on the road, it's a very high chance that they will be. And when they are, it creates a lot of wind flow that can impact upon the attachments within the house and also the security, securing between the walls, the roof, and the subfloor structure. So we do think it's a desirable thing is to have the trailer and the connection certified by an engineer. So this will not be too dissimilar to the reasons for people here in this session, in the conference, about what is it that they're looking to achieve, and what is their motivation. So, and this is in no special order, but if from an environmental perspective, we can have a reduction in our energy use when you're on grid, and that is you're using less resources, you're using less water, you're using less gas, you're using less electricity. You can also be off-grid as well, where you're generating. Now, that's generating electricity, yes, and maybe biogas, but you can't generate enough or capture enough rainwater typically, especially in our environment, because we're the driest inhabited continent in the world. So we can't generate enough rainwater capture for our tiny houses. So that's something that we need to connect to, or have rainwater tanks get filled up by water carters. So you can save money on your rent and your mortgage and your other bills. You can also make income through your B&B and weekend escape. So my prototype is on B&B on a friend's property of 10 acres in a bushland property. And obviously we're coming out of, we have come out of COVID. I'm in Melbourne, so we've been in lockdown for a lot of months, and people out of Melbourne are trying to get away for the weekend for a 3 to 4 day escape. So it's been really, really popular, and the return on that has been quite exceptional. Also, you can create simplicity and freedom in your life. You declutter. The speaker before us was talking about, how to declutter, how to plan for that, downsizing and minimizing. The less you have, the less you have to spend, spend money on, the latest gadgets. It's also your conscience. You might want to have some flexibility and mobility. Maybe you want to live a more transient lifestyle, but not, if you're going to be moving every single week, probably don't get a tiny house in Australia. We would encourage them just to get a caravan. If you're going to travel and plonk and stay for, 1 to 2 years, tiny house, great. Really, really good. But we all know that they are semi-trailer size, in height. So as a result of that, you've got a big structure that you're towing around on the roads. It can, stave off homelessness. And for us, it can fit better with our, household occupants. So 58% in 2011, our Australian Bureau of Statistics found that 58% of dwellings have one or two residents. That's, incredible. But only 23% of our houses actually have one or two bedrooms. So we're building far bigger houses than we need for the number of people that are living in those houses. So who would choose, just a couple of more minutes, who would choose to live tiny? Well, they're passionate about, a smaller environmental footprint, wanting more disposable income, younger people wanting to get into the housing market, older people who don't want to have a mortgage, aged and wanting to be near family but independent, over 50 with less choices relating to housing, single women who have often less money in their retirement superannuation than men, landowners who have space or land and wishing to get extra income or have family visit, farmers needing housing for a transient workforce, and individuals or organisations focused to provide solutions. We do have some good news stories, which gives us hope. And this is back in, 2018, a blueprint, called the Housing Tiny House Resource was produced, which is actually looking at, a number of different scenarios of how tiny houses could be located together, one, multiple, or a community. And so that is a document that still has stood the test of time, and that's what we pull out and, use as a advocacy tool for our decision makers and our regulators. This is a pretty recent one. Elle Patton has a business called Tiny Nonprofit, is one of the founders for that. She was actually one of the founders of the Australian Tiny House Association. And she has located her tiny house, built by Tiny House to Go, and positioned that in an inner city suburb of Melbourne. St Kilda, Port Phillip City Council, where it's located, is a very progressive council. She's got a permit to live there for 2 years. It's on somebody else's land that was vacant. It's coupled with a community garden, and we're hoping that at the end of that 2 years, it will help change the profile and exposure of tiny houses so that they become more acceptable. So a very progressive council in that one. This was a legal case that was won by this architect and her carpenter, her builder husband. They were parking their tiny house in their family's backyard, and because there was a dispute with the Brisbane City Council, which was